So our second story is about Frank the healer. So I've done a few of these based on my character Frank in my novella The Bank Manager and the Bum. This story is simply called Danny. Bit more serious. Frank arrived in the city the way he arrived everywhere. Quiet as cigarette smoke, edging along the seams where people stopped looking. It was a late November, the kind of cold that didn't just sit on your skin, but settled into your bones like a debt. Oh, excuse me, get comfortable. The kind of night that made the streetlights look tired. The pavement in this part of town held old spillages, lager, chip fat, something darker by the bus stop that the rain hadn't quite managed to forgive. Rex padded beside him, an Alsatian with a scar. I've no idea, Rowena, she hasn't said. An Alsatian with a scar along his muzzle, and the steady, watchful gaze of a dog who'd seen too much and decided not to be sentimental about it. His ears flicked at every sudden laugh, every shouted argument, every car door slammed too hard. Frank's coat was a second-hand army thing that smelled faintly of damp and smoke. His beard had grown in uneven, and his hair sat in a tangle beneath a woolen hat. Most people glanced at him and saw what they expected to see: a tramp. A man who'd fallen off the edge and was now just background. They didn't see the careful way he watched, or how his hands, cracked and grimy, scraped raw by cold, were always held slightly apart from his body, like they were carrying something fragile. They didn't see the golden light that lived under his skin. He'd learned to keep it hidden. Not because it was a shameful thing, but because miracles drew the wrong sort of attention, and because healing always took something from him. The first time he'd realised he'd saved a kid from choking outside a kebab shop. Light pouring from his hands like a sunrise. Afterwards he'd collapsed in an alleyway and vomited until his ribs hurt. The second time he'd mended a broken arm behind a church hall, and for 3 days after he couldn't keep his eyes open. It wasn't a fair trade, but the world was rarely fair. Tonight he needed somewhere dry, somewhere Rex could curl up without shivering. A neon sign buzzed in the drizzle. The King's Arms. One of those pubs that had gone through a rebrand and lost. The windows were fogged. Inside, warm light and loud talk. Frank wasn't welcome in places like that, not properly, but some landlords would let a man stand by the fire if he kept quiet and didn't bring trouble. He pushed the door open. The smell hit first: beer, cheap perfume, wet coats. Conversation dipped for a heartbeat. People's eyes flicked to him and away, as if looking too long might be contagious. Behind the bar, a woman in her 40s with a tired face and bright lipstick watched him. Her name, stitched on a badge, was Jane. She didn't smile. She didn't scowl either. Dog, she said. Good dog, Frank replied. His voice was low, scraped by weather. No dogs. Frank started to back out, already feeling the familiar sting of being moved along. But Jane's gaze slid past him, to Rex's ribs showing under his fur, to the way the dog didn't beg or whine, just stood steady like a guard. All right, she sighed, if he doesn't make a mess and you stay by the door. Frank nodded once, grateful in the way you're grateful for small mercies. He moved to the corner near the radiator where the tiles were warm. Rex lay down at his feet, head on his paws, eyes still open. Frank stood there with his hands tucked under his arms, trying not to take up space. That's when he saw the man at the far end of the bar. He was young, late 20s, maybe. But his face had the drawn, brittle look of someone who'd been awake too long. A thin sheen of sweat on his forehead, despite the cold. His pupils were wide. His hands kept rubbing at his nose, his jaw working like he was chewing through anxiety. He had a bruise blooming along his cheekbone, yellow at the edges, and his knuckles were scraped raw. A woman beside him, older, maybe his mum, was talking to him quietly, her body angled towards him, like she could shield him from the room. She kept touching his arms, her fingers trembling. He flinched every time the pub door opened, every time someone laughed too loud. Frank recognised it. Not just the drugs, if that's what it was. The fear that lived underneath. The one that made you jump at shadows, because shadows sometimes had names. At the table behind them, 3 lads in matching puffer jackets were drinking pints too fast. One of them, with hard eyes, kept glancing over, smiling, without humour, predatory, patient. Like he owned the air around him. Frank's stomach tightened. He'd learned long ago the trouble didn't always announce itself. Sometimes it just sat there, waiting for the right moment to tip. Welcome, Paula Jane. The lad with the hard eyes got up, wandered over to the bar, leaned in close to the anxious young man. All right, Danny, he said loud enough to be heard. You got it. Danny's face went pale. His mum's hand tightened on his arm. I told you, Danny said, voice thin. I don't have it. The lad, Callum, Frank heard someone else say. His name, smiled wider. Come on. Don't mug me off in front of everyone. You think I'm a charity? Danny's mum stood up. Leave him alone, she said, trying for firm and landing somewhere near desperate. He's trying to get clean. Callum's eyes flicked to her. Oh, look, Mummy's here. Isn't that sweet? He turned back to Danny, voice lowering. You owe. You know what happens when you owe. Danny's breathing started to go too fast. Excuse me. Danny's breathing started to go too fast. Frank could see it, the tightening chest, the panic building. Danny's fingers clawed at the edge of the bar like he could hold himself down. Jane behind the bar said, "Take it outside, Callum." Callum didn't even look at her. Just having a chat. Frank watched Rex's ears tilt forward. The dog's body stiffened slightly, ready. Frank had promised himself years ago he wouldn't go looking for fights. Thank you so much, 23,000 likes, thank you. He was tired. He was always tired. But he'd also promised himself he wouldn't stand by and watch the strong grind the weak into dust. Healing wasn't always the answer. Sometimes you had to stop the injury before it happened. Thank you for the roses, Rowena. Frank stepped forward. Not fast, not dramatic, just a man moving like he belonged. Thank you for the follow, Anne-Marie. He stopped a few feet from Callum and said, "He said he doesn't have it." Callum blinked, annoyed at being interrupted by someone he hadn't classified as a threat. His gaze raked Frank. Coat, beard, worn boots, the dog. "Who are you?" Oh, what's up there? Sorry. Who are you? Callum sneered. "Just someone listening," Frank said. Callum laughed. "Mate, this has got nothing to do with you. Jog on." Frank held his ground. It does now. The room went quieter again. People love drama as long as it's at a safe distance. Callum leaned in close enough that Frank could smell the lager on his breath. "You want to be a hero? You want to get your head kicked in for some junkie?" Danny made a small sound, half protest, half shame. Frank didn't flinch. "I don't want anything, but I'm here." Callum's smile vanished. Anger sharpened his features. He glanced at Rex, then back at Frank, calculating. "Fine," he said, stepping back. "Outside then. See how brave you are without the pub watching." Frank's heart thudded. He knew this dance well. Outside meant corners, meant friends, meant boots and ribs while everyone inside turned the music up a notch and pretended not to hear. He could have backed down. He could have walked away, left Danny to his debt, left his mum to the slow terror of waiting for knocks on the door. Instead, Frank said, "No." Callum's eyebrows lifted. "No?" "No," Frank repeated. "You're not taking him outside. You're not taking him anywhere." Callum's jaw worked. He took a step forward, fists tightening. And in that moment, Danny's breathing tipped over the edge. He made a choking sound and crumpled sideways, clutching his chest. His mum screamed his name. "Hey, Joe." Thank you for the heart, me, Joe. His mum screamed his name. People shifted, chairs scraping. Someone swore, someone laughed nervously, then stopped. Frank's body moved before his mind finished deciding. He dropped to his knees beside Danny. Danny's eyes were wide, wet, unfocused. Panic attack, Frank thought, or something worse, The drugs, the stress, the cold, any of it could tip a heart into trouble. Danny clawed at his own throat like he couldn't get enough air. "Look at me," Frank said, voice steady. "Danny, look at me." Danny's gaze snapped to him, desperate. My word, my throat's so dry. Frank put his hands on Danny's shoulders, feeling the thin fabric of his hoodie, the bones beneath. He kept his thumbs away from skin. He didn't want the room to see what he can do. But Danny's breath hitched again, and for a flicker, Frank saw the path this could go down. Ambulance, sirens, maybe too late, maybe a body in a pub while everyone filmed it on their phones. Frank made a choice. He slid one hand under Danny's hoodie, pressing his palm against Danny's sternum. Heat flared, not warmth like a radiator, something deeper, brighter, a golden light that didn't illuminate the room but filled Frank's bones, flooding his arm, burning up his veins like honey turned to fire. Danny gasped one long, ragged inhale that broke the panic's grip. Frank felt the inside of Danny's chest like a musician hearing a wrong note. He coaxed the rhythm back, nudged it gentle as turning a dial. The golden light pulsed, answering his intent. Danny's breathing slowed, his shoulders unclenched, his eyes focused. I don't know what's flashing. Is it the telly?
Probably.
Don't worry about it, Mary, unless it's bothering you.
Yeah, it's probably that.
Where was I? Danny's breathing slowed, his shoulders unclenched, his eyes focused. Frank's own vision blurred at the edges. The light always cost. It pulled at his strength, drained him like a tide going out. He kept it small, just enough. Danny swallowed, coughing once. "What?" he whispered. "You're all right," Frank said, though his voice wavered. Danny's mum grabbed Frank's sleeve. "What did you do?" Her face was wet with tears. He... Frank shook his head slightly. "Just breathe," he told Danny. "In through your nose, out slow. You're here, you're safe." Danny nodded, clinging to the instruction like a rope. Frank withdrew his hand, quickly hiding it in his coat pocket, as if he'd only been steadying the lad. Around them the room buzzed with confusion. Someone said, "He was having a fit." Someone else said, "Call an ambulance." Jane was already on the phone, jaw set. Callum had taken a step back, his bravado wobbling. It's hard to look tough when someone's nearly died in front of you. Frank got to his feet, swaying slightly. Rex rose too, pressing his flank against Frank's leg, solid and warm. Callum recovered enough to sneer. "Look at this, playing nurse now. Doesn't change the fact he owes me." Frank met his eyes. The tiredness in his body was heavy. But there was something else too, an old, quiet anger. "You heard him," Frank said. "He's trying to get clean." Callum snorted. "Not my problem." Frank nodded. "No, it's mine." Callum frowned. "What's that supposed to mean?" Frank took his hands out of his pockets, palms open. In the dim light, they looked just like hands, dirty, rough, unremarkable. You've got a choice, Frank said. You can walk out that door and leave him alone, or you can stay and make a scene while Jane calls the police and the ambulance, and every person in here remembers your face. Callum laughed, but he wasn't confident. Police don't do anything. Sometimes they do, Frank said, and sometimes they don't. But sometimes a mum who's frightened finds her voice and keeps it. Sometimes a lad gets a second chance because someone stopped you tonight. You don't get to be the end of his story. Callum's gaze flicked around. People were watching now properly, not with sympathy for Danny, necessarily, but with that hungry curiosity that made predators cautious. The lads at Callum's table looked uncertain. A room's mood can shift like the weather. Jane slammed the phone down and pointed at the door. Out, she barked. Now. Callum bristled. You can't. I can, Jane snapped, and I will. And if you don't go, I'll tell the police you threatened a vulnerable person and caused a medical emergency in my pub. Callum's jaw worked again. He looked at Frank one more time, trying to read him, trying to find an angle. Frank just stood there, Rex's lips lifted slightly. Not a growl, just a warning. Callum spat on the floor, missing Frank by a foot, and somehow managing to look like a child doing it. This isn't over, he muttered, and stalked out, his mates scrambling after him. The door banged, cold air rushing in, then was gone. For a second, there was quiet, and then the pub exhaled, conversation bubbling back in messy bursts. Frank's knees threatened to fold. He leaned against the wall, pretending he was just resting. Danny's mum came over, eyes wide. Who are you? Frank, he said. It felt strange saying his name like it mattered. She looked at Rex. And him? Rex. Danny, still pale, stood with Jane's help. He stared at Frank like he'd grown wings. You saved me, Danny said, voice hushed. Frank shook his head. You did the hard bit. You came in here instead of going back to him. Danny's mouth trembled. I tried. I'm trying. But it's... He swallowed, ashamed. It's like my own head wants me dead. Frank understood that only too well. Jane approached him, wiping her hands on a bar towel. Ambulance is on the way, she said. Her gaze cut to Frank's hands, then away. You all right? Frank nodded, though his stomach rolled. Fine. Jane watched him a moment longer, as if deciding whether to ask questions. She didn't. Instead, she reached under the bar and slid a mug across the counter. Tea, strong, steam rising. Hey, Nellie. Drink, she said, and your dog can have some water. Frank's throat tightened. Kindness could be as shocking as cruelty when you weren't used to it. Thank you, he managed. Danny's mum hovered, then blurted, We've got a spare room just for the night. You and your dog. Please, I don't know what you did, but... Frank held up a hand gently. No. Her face fell. It's kind, Frank said, but I can't. I don't stay. Why? Danny asked, desperate. You could help people. Frank looked at his hands, at the grime under his nails, at the faint ache that now ran up his arms like a bruise. The light was quiet again, sleeping under his skin, but it left him hollowed out. I do help, he said softly, when I can. But if I stay, I become something people chase or worship or blame or try to exploit. Thank you, Rowena. And then the good gets twisted into something else. Danny's mum wiped her cheeks. But where will you go? Frank took a sip of tea. It scalded his tongue. He welcomed the pain. It anchored him. Somewhere else, he said. The ambulance arrived, paramedics brisk and professional. Danny went with them into the ambulance for tests, his mum clinging to his hand. Before he left, Danny looked back at Frank. Will I be all right? He asked. Frank hesitated. He couldn't promise, he never promised. The world didn't keep those bargains. But he could offer something else. You've got a chance, Frank said. Use it. Danny nodded, hard, as if memorising the words. When the doors closed and the sirens faded, the pub settled into its usual noise again. Jane cleaned a glass with more force than necessary. Frank finished his tea slowly. Rex drank water from a bowl someone had set on the floor. Jane came over and without a word placed a wrapped sandwich and a packet of crisps beside Frank's elbow. Frank looked up. I can't pay. Jane shrugged. Didn't ask you to. He stared at her, searching for the catch. Jane met his gaze evenly. My brother died of that stuff, she said, voice flat. If someone had stood up for him once, maybe he'd have had a different ending. Maybe not, but I'd like to think so. Frank swallowed. I'm sorry. Jane nodded once, brisk. Eat your sandwich, then go, before I change my mind. Frank smiled, a small thing, barely there, but real. All right. Later, when the pub was emptier and the cold had crept back into the corners, Frank stepped outside with Rex at his side. The city was a smear of light and puddles and distant shouting. They walked past the bus stop with the old stain, past the shuttered takeaway, past a row of terraced houses where someone was arguing through a letterbox, past a corner where a man slept wrapped in a bin bag, face turned to the wall. Frank paused, watching that man's breath puff faintly. His hands tingled, the golden light stirring like a heartbeat. He clenched his fists and shoved them into his pockets. Not tonight, he thought. Not unless he had to. Not unless it mattered. Rex looked up at him, brown eyes steady, as if to say, We'll know when, Dad. Frank nodded, and they kept walking. Somewhere behind them, a lad named Danny was on his way to a hospital instead of a grave. Somewhere ahead, another problem waited in the dark, and Frank, tired, hungry, stubbornly hopeful, kept moving towards it, one damp street at a time. And for those that enjoy